Welcome to another journey through history, a story woven from the fog of time, where the present and the past meet at the crossroads of science, superstition, and the unknown. Imagine yourself standing at the heart of 19th century London, under gaslit streets and looming factories that churn out smoke and soot into the sky. It is a world that seems to pulse with progressive roads' new inventions and the promise of a brighter future, but it is also a time where the dead are never truly gone. In the midst of these industrial wonders, something peculiar stirs within the people. They are drawn to the invisible, to the supernatural, to the idea that death might not be the end. Ghostly whispers and mediums willing to channel spirits are becoming all the rage. Today, we will uncover one of history's more curious and unsettling phenomena: the Victorian obsession with spiritualism. At a time when science was racing ahead, discovering the laws of nature, the Victorians were simultaneously captivated by the idea of communicating with the dead. It was a movement that, from its humble beginnings, captured the imagination of millions, baffling the brightest minds of the age. And as we delve into this strange obsession, we will see how it all started, what it really meant, and how a simple prank led to a craze that crossed the globe. So, sit back and let yourself be transported to another time, where the line between the living and the dead was not as clear as it is today. We begin with a moment in the life of a young boy, one whose reality was filled with soot, smoke, and a harsh life in industrial London. Imagine yourself as a young boy in the heart of London, just a speck among the endless clouds of smoke that billow from the chimneys of the factories. You are one of the many chimney sweeps, your small hands blackened with soot, your lungs full of the choking dust of the city. Your world is one of darkness, a never-ending cycle of sweeping narrow, suffocating flues, climbing into chimneys that seem to stretch forever. The smell of coal and the acrid scent of burning wood permeate your clothes, your hair, your skin. Your life is short, brutal, and worn down by the hard, relentless work. The average chimney sweep lives only a few years before the dust takes its toll, suffocating the breath out of them, or the hard labor causes their body to break down. Disease, accidents, and the unforgiving nature of your work are constant companions, leaving you with little hope for anything beyond the small, fleeting moments of rest between jobs. Yet, in the shadows of this grim existence, there is a world that intrigues you. The stories of the Spiritualist movement that has begun to capture the imagination of people across the city offer a strange and alluring comfort. You hear whispers of mediums who claim to speak with the dead, of voices from beyond the grave that offer messages of hope and peace. For someone like you, whose life is bound to the possibility of an early grave, the thought of communicating with a lost parent, a brother or sister who passed too soon, seems like a dream. The idea that death is not an end, that it is possible to reach across the veil and speak to those who have gone, offers you a glimpse of something beyond the suffocating darkness of the chimneys. The rich, the elite, the well-to-do of London have begun to attend these, gathering in dimly lit parlors to hear the voices of the dead, to receive comfort from the spirits of their loved ones. For you, this seems like an escape, a way to transcend the harshness of your reality. But you know, deep down, that this world is far removed from your own. As you crawl into another narrow flue, your body aching, your breath shallow from the dust, you can almost hear the laughter and murmurs of the wealthy, the men and women dressed in fine clothes, sitting in elegant rooms, while the dead speak to them. Their lives are so far from yours. You climb, gasping for air, feeling the weight of your own mortality pressing down on you. But in your mind, the idea of reaching out to the other side, of communicating with a loved one lost too soon, is both a distant dream and a cruel reminder of how different your life is from theirs. It's hard to reconcile the world of the dead with the world of the living, especially when one's own life is so precarious, so fragile. But even in the blackened air of your work, you hear about the messages, the promises of life beyond the grave. It's a movement that has swept through the city, and you find yourself wondering if it could be true. If perhaps there is something beyond the chimneys, beyond the soot and death, that seems to mark your every step. As the world around you shifts and changes, the rise of spiritualism becomes a curious contrast to the grimness of your daily life. The idea of life after death, the notion that there is something more than this hard, fleeting existence, tugs at something deep inside you. It's a comfort, a fantasia light in the darkness. But as you continue your work, climbing up and down, breathing in the dirt and grime of London, the distance between you and the spiritualists grows ever larger, and the world they inhabit becomes something you can only dream of. Now that we have glimpsed the gritty, soot-filled world of industrial London, let us travel back in time to the humble beginnings of the spiritualist movement itself, a movement that would soon sweep across the globe, enticing the rich and poor alike with promises of messages from the dead. This story begins in a small, quiet farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, in 1848, where and Maggie Fox would unwittingly spark one of the most bizarre and widespread movements of the 19th century. The Fox sisters were not born into wealth or privilege. Their family, like many in rural America, lived in modest conditions, with little to their name except their labor and their land. But the Fox sisters were about to become famous for something that seemed utterly ordinary at first glance, something that would eventually transform them into the faces of the spiritualist movement. It all began on a quiet night when the Fox family moved into a new house in Soon after settling in, strange things began to happen. The family heard unexplained noises, rapping sounds, tapping on the walls, and mysterious knocking that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, the Foxes assumed it was a practical joke or the work of mischievous spirits. But the noises continued, and soon they became more persistent, more insistent, as if the house itself were trying to communicate with them. The young sisters, Kate and Maggie, were both deeply curious about these strange happenings. In the dark silence of their new home, they began to experiment with these mysterious sounds. It wasn't long before they realized that they could replicate the sounds themselves. Kate and Maggie began to crack their joints, especially their toes, producing loud, sharp raps that echoed through the quiet rooms of the house. With each crack, they received a response, a confirmation of their discovery. A knock for yes, two knocks for no. The sisters quickly realized that they could manipulate the sounds to make it appear as though they were communicating with the spirit. What started as innocent curiosity soon transformed into something far more elaborate. The girls, fascinated by the power they now held, began to perform for their family, using their new spirit as an invisible medium, asking it questions and receiving answers through the rapping sounds. Their family, initially skeptical, soon became convinced that the house was indeed haunted. But it wasn't just their family who took notice. Word of the strange noises soon spread beyond the farmhouse. Neighbors, local townsfolk, and eventually even spiritualists from nearby cities came to witness the eerie phenomenon for themselves. Kate and Maggie, still only teenagers, found themselves at the center of a growing spectacle. The girls were asked to perform public, where they would communicate with spirits by cracking their joints and eliciting raps in response to questions. At first, the raps were interpreted as simple noises, but over time, the messages they delivered became more complex. People came from all around, eager to hear from their deceased relatives, and the sisters quickly rose to fame. They were invited to hold in larger cities, attracting the attention of both curious onlookers and prominent figures. The sisters found themselves at the epicenter of a new movement that promised a way to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. A movement that would soon grow far beyond their wildest expectations. But with fame came scrutiny. As the sisters' popularity grew, so too did the questions surrounding their methods. Skeptics and investigators began to challenge the validity of the rapping sounds, and rumors spread that the Fox sisters might be faking it. Some suggested that the girls were simply playing a trick, manipulating the sounds with their joints. And indeed, as the years went on, the sisters themselves began to grow uneasy with the lies they had unwittingly spun. It wasn't long before the truth came to light. In 1888, nearly 40 years after they first began, Kate and Maggie Fox confessed that they had been faking the entire thing. The raps they had produced were in fact caused by the cracking of their joints. The two sisters, now adults, admitted that they had never communicated with any spirits at all. They had, in their youth, found a way to entertain themselves and their family, and in doing so, had sparked a worldwide movement that had completely spiraled out of control. Their confession was shocking to many, but it also highlighted something deeper: how easily people could be deceived, how desperate they were for answers to the great unknown, and how susceptible even the brightest minds were to the allure of the supernatural. Despite their confession, the damage had been done. Spiritualism continued to grow, with mediums and messages from the dead becoming a fixture of Victorian life. The Fox sisters, though disillusioned with the movement they had unwittingly created, remained a central part of the story, their names forever associated with the Spiritualist Craze. The legacy of the Fox sisters is one of both revelation and regret. Their teenage prank had inadvertently fueled a worldwide phenomenon that, for better or worse, would shape the course of the 19th century. The movement they ignited would capture the imaginations of the wealthy, the curious, and the frightened alike, as people sought comfort in the idea that the dead were not truly gone, that they could still communicate with those they had lost. But as you reflect on their story, imagine yourself for a moment in the shoes of a Victorian person, someone who longed for answers in a world that seemed to be constantly changing. For many, the idea of contacting the dead was a way to hold on to something beyond the grave, a way to ease the pain of loss and find meaning in a world that often seemed indifferent to their suffering. As we now step away from the shadows of the rooms and the trickery of the mediums, we enter the world of the elite, where grief, once a private affair, was transformed into a public spectacle. It was here, in the grand palaces of the British monarchy, that the Spiritualist Craze found a particularly influential audience. And the story of one woman, in particular, would forever intertwine royal mourning with the supernatural. Queen Victoria, a figure of immense power and cultural significance, became both a symbol of Victorian mourning and a key driver behind the spiritualist movement, embraced by the upper classes. Her life, filled with the duties and responsibilities of ruling an empire, took a profound turn in 1861 with the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert. His passing sent shockwaves through the royal family, but it also marked the beginning of a deeply personal and public mourning process that would captivate the nation. Victoria's grief was all. She withdrew from public life, shrouding herself in the black of mourning attire. For the Queen, the death of her husband was not merely a loss of a spouse. It was a loss of a partner who had been integral to her reign, who had shaped her worldview and her sense of duty. Her grief was profound, and in the years that followed, her mourning became a performance, a spectacle that the public could both witness and, in some ways, participate in. The Queen's sorrow, as it seeped into her every action, had a ripple effect across British society, and it wasn't long before this mourning took on a life of its own. Her withdrawal from public view was mirrored by many of her subjects, who began to see mourning as not only a personal expression of grief, but a moral and societal duty. In the midst of this culture of mourning, the idea of communicating with the dead began to take root more firmly within elite circles. The same royals and aristocrats who had been touched by grief found themselves drawn to the idea of spiritualism, where the possibility of speaking to the dead, especially loved ones lost, became a way of seeking closure and solace. It was during this time, in the salons and parlors of the elite, that began to be held, not just as private, intimate affairs, but as social events. The upper classes, with their exposure to both the latest scientific advancements and the latest fashionable trends, quickly adopted spiritualism as part of their mourning rituals. The deceased, particularly those beloved figures like Prince Albert, could now be summoned by mediums to offer comfort and counsel. The dead were no longer out of reach. They were only a message away, accessible through a medium's voice or the mysterious tapping of unseen hands. Queen Victoria herself, in her profound and lasting mourning for Albert, was said to have held several at Buckingham Palace. She sought not only a connection to her lost husband, but perhaps an answer to the question that haunted many in her circle: what happens after death? The very nature of her grief, prolonged and deeply public, made the supernatural seem even more real, even more urgent. The public, already enmeshed in the grip of spiritualism, watched closely as the Queen's mourning became an emblem of the times, a reflection of the deep emotional lives of those who held the power of the empire in their hands. It wasn't just Victoria's mourning that added fuel to the spiritualist fire. The very nature of the Victorian elite's relationship with death, an ongoing, intimate connection through elaborate funeral rites and memorials, melded seamlessly with the emerging trend of mediumship. Wealth and status offered the elite access to the best mediums, the most elaborate, and the most convincing spiritual performances. For the wealthy, spiritualism became not just a way of seeking answers, but a way to maintain their connection to the world of the dead. It offered a way to perform grief, to mark their loss with solemn rituals, and perhaps to receive one last message of reassurance from those they had lost. As we imagine the grand parlors of Victorian homes, lit by the soft glow of gas lamps, the air thick with the scent of incense and mourning wreaths, we can almost hear the quiet murmurs of high society. In these spaces, the very act of mourning, whether for a monarch, a beloved spouse, or a close friend, was a collective experience. It was no longer just about private sorrow, but about a shared ritual, a shared belief that through these rituals, there might be a way to make peace with the dead. The Victorian elite were not simply mourners, they were performers of grief, and the stage upon which they performed this grief was the idea that death was not an end, that there could be messages from beyond, created a comforting illusion for those who had the means to partake in it. For them, spiritualism wasn't just a fleeting trend, it was a way to sustain the connection to a world they could not reach, a bridge between the living and the dead. It is fascinating to consider how something as deeply personal as grief could become so public and so intertwined with a widespread cultural movement. What began as a private royal mourning for Prince Albert soon became an entire nation's ritual, within messages from the other side, transforming mourning into something shared, something that could be experienced not just by the Queen, but by anyone willing to participate. And so, as the Queen sat in the dim light of her chambers, holding in the quiet spaces of her palace, the idea that the dead could still speak to the living became more than just a curiosity. It became a comforting fantasy for an entire class. The elite, who had once known only the certainty of their own control, now found themselves reaching out to the unknown, seeking answers, comfort, and connection from a world they could not see but wished to believe in. As we bring our exploration of the Victorian spiritualist craze to a close, we find that the line between belief and skepticism was not as clear-cut as it might seem. What began as a prank by two young sisters in a quiet farmhouse soon spiraled into a worldwide movement, captivating the minds of millions, from chimney sweeps to queens. It was a time when grief was both a personal and public spectacle, and the search for comfort in the face of death became a deeply shared experience. The Victorian era was one of progress and change, yet it was also a time when the mysteries of the afterlife seemed more real than ever, especially when the grief of the living demanded answers. Whether by cracking joints or holding elaborate people sought ways to connect with those who had passed, hoping for a sign, a message, or a final moment of connection. In this age of scientific discovery, the supernatural seemed to promise something deeper, something beyond the cold certainty of death. As you drift off to sleep, think of the gaslit rooms, the tables, and the flickering candles that lit the faces of those who sought comfort from the other side. Their world, so far removed from our own, is a reminder that no matter how much time passes, the mysteries of life and death continue to stir the human imagination. Good night.